What can be worse than being in prison? We'll tell you what, just keep watching this video to see some of the most horrible prison experiments on humans of all time. Herophilius of Alexandria has been dubbed the father of anatomy because of his contributions to medical science. But he would have never been able to get that title without committing some serious atrocities. Long before the time of anesthesia and numbing medication, you really only had two options if you wanted to study human anatomy. One was to go on a shopping spree, and by shopping spree we mean robbing graves. The other option was to cut up live humans. Would you like to take a guess on what Herophilius chose to do? You see, the problem with dead bodies was that by the time the physician got his hands on them, the organs had already started to rot, and he really couldn't study them in detail. This is why Herophilius would often perform vivisections on prisoners. Now, for all you non-geeks out there, vivisections is basically when a doctor cuts open someone alive to view the internal living structure of the human body. The worst part? They could feel everything, from the cold, sharp metal piercing their skin to Herophilius fishing around inside their bodies. Some sources claim that these experiments were only conducted on prisoners that were on death row, and this was a way to get them to repay for their crimes. According to reports, Herophilius used to have more than 600 live prisoners at a time to conduct his research. Now that's just pure evil. Now you tell us, was Herophilius a trailblazer or an executioner? Radiation experiments. When the US first started experimenting with nuclear weapons back in the early 1940s, no one was really sure what sort of impact they would have on humans. So, to figure this out, the US government conducted a study where they exposed unsuspecting people to alarming levels of radiation. They would use patients, prisoners, and even mentally handicapped children as their test subjects. So, how did they pull this off exactly? Well, since a lot of these people were under state care, it was easy for the US government to lace their food with radioactive iron and calcium. They would also sometimes directly inject test subjects with radioactive material, but that was very far and few between. The test subjects are reported to have become very sick after being exposed to extreme levels of radiation. Some people died within a few days of being exposed, while others developed deadly tumors and cancer. These trials were done under strict confidentiality from the start. As the Cold War began, Americans were terrified of an all-out nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Therefore, the military and scientists involved kept a wartime mindset and crossed any lines they had to. All these experiments remained top secret until the 90s, when then-President Bill Clinton came clean and revealed all the harrowing details to the public.
The United States government actually did carry out on our citizens experiments involving radiation.
According to these records, the Atomic Energy Commission had been funding these tests to study the effects of radiation on the human body since the early 1940s. All experiments were carried out on an unsuspecting American citizen who had checked into hospitals, orphanages, or were in prisons. Basically, anyone under government care was liable to be secretly injected with varying amounts of plutonium and other radioactive materials without their knowledge and consent.
Scientists injected plutonium into 18 patients without their knowledge.
The Filipino Plague. In 1906, the US government wanted to do some research on the bubonic plague that wiped out half of Europe centuries ago. To do this, the US Army, along with some scientists, infected 5 Filipino prisoners with the disease. 4 of these inmates ended up dying within a few days, and it is reported that around a dozen more got infected through contact. The Governor General of the Philippines appointed a general committee to investigate the matter, and the United States Senate demanded information about it. No mainland investigations were conducted despite the Senate, the Secretary of War, and even the President being notified about the developments. This malpractice done by the U.S. also gave leeway to Nazi scientists in the Philippines to conduct experiments of their own. Mind control. Between 1964 to 1968, the U.S. government did a series of experiments on inmates at the Holmesburg prison in Philadelphia. Around 320 prisoners were made guinea pigs for a mind control experiment. The government had doctors administer inmates with powerful hallucinogenics. They wanted to see how high of a dose they could give before the human mind became completely useless. One prisoner that was able to make it out of this hellhole revealed to the press that Holmesburg was the Kmart of human experimentation, and that a single inmate was undergoing more than a dozen experiments at the same time.
I just felt I couldn't cope, I couldn't adjust after the LSD.
The doctor who supervised all these experiments later came out and told the press that he was only doing what he was ordered to do and follow protocol.
The informed consent, as we now know it, was not a part of research at that time.
The worst part is that this is only one chapter in the dark history of Holmesburg. Around 30 years before, in 1938, the prison turned into a laboratory. A bunch of prisoners went on a hunger strike. To take care of this, the warden sent them to what were called bake ovens for punishment. According to reports, more than 4 prisoners were burned to death and dozens more were permanently injured that night.
The pain was so excruciating, felt like somebody was sticking me with 1,000,000 pins.
Sure, the mind control and roasting alive might seem terrible, but it's nowhere near what the CIA has done to their prisoners. The intelligence agency has been accused of violating all sorts of human rights at their super-secret prisons at black sites. We're talking about stuff like waterboarding, sleep deprivation, and physical torture. You name it, and the CIA will have done it. They would even bring in specialists to measure the level of pain at which a prisoner would crack during interrogations. The CIA denies allegations, and the government refuses to investigate them, which makes this whole situation sound even more suspicious.
Well, we don't torture people.
Torched with lasers. In 2010, authorities wanted to test out the active denial system. This weapon is a really powerful laser that can be used to stop enemies by heating their bodies up so much that it becomes unbearable. The active denial system was originally meant to be used in wars, but something happened that made authorities think that it would be better to use this thing on protesters instead. Yes, you heard that right. The US government decided that they would use a weapon meant for a war on their own citizens. Apparently, the laser will only be used under dire circumstances when rioters get out of hand. Authorities also claim that the laser doesn't do any long-term damage and its effects wear off instantly once the person moves out of the weapon's range.
This weapon offers a long-range ability to reach out and give a non-lethal effect to a human and tell them, don't come here.
But a lot of people contest those claims because of what happened with the first few test subjects. You see, they decided to test out this technology on prisoners in Pitchess Detention Center in Los Angeles. According to reports, the laser ended up having some serious long-term effects on the test subjects. Some of the prisoners went permanently blind, while others are reported to have developed cancer, turned to mutants. From the early 1960s to the 1970s, Dr. Carl Heller conducted research on male prisoners in Washington and Oregon State, where he would subject them to extreme levels of radiation to see what effect it would have on their reproductive systems. According to reports, Heller conducted this research on behalf of the Atomic Energy Commission. He selected a small group of prisoners and radiated them to an extreme. Not only did Dr. Heller expose the men to harmful levels of radiation, but he also forcefully sterilized them so, and I quote, they couldn't pass on their radiation-induced mutants. A few of these men later sued the government. Apparently, the men were each given $5 for permanently being stripped of their ability to procreate. This isn't the only time the US government put its citizens through extreme levels of radiation. Other similar experiments were performed, mostly on poor black people. The worst part is that most of these people were cancer patients instead of prisoners. Not that that would have been any better. Apparently, a few rogue doctors convinced their patients to sign up for radiation therapy under the impression that this would cure their cancer. But that was far from the truth. In reality, the government was trying to see what would happen to the human body when it was put under extreme levels of radiation. They were apparently trying to see if they would undergo any sort of mutations or get any special abilities. That obviously did not happen. The test subjects only got sicker. Wow, this really makes you think how far the authorities are willing to go to get what they want. Prisoners, children, cancer patients, they literally don't care. Injected with cow blood. In 1942, the U.S. Navy injected dozens of Massachusetts prisoners with cow's blood. It's incredibly difficult to say why they did this, but some reports suggest that the government wanted to create a biological weapon, while others claim that it was to purify the process of extracting albumin from plasma. Whatever the reason may be, doesn't change the fact that more than 60 prisoners ended up dying as a result of these experiments. Well, that's it for the most horrible prison experiments on humans of all time. What do you think is worse, being put in prison or undergoing these experiments? See you next time with something new. And until then, goodbye.